Well, thanks for being here this morning. Grab your coffee if you need it, because we're going to do a table discussion, so I need your brains turned on this morning. Get ready to have some good discussion with others, and then maybe volunteer to share a little bit about what you've talked about. So Glittering Vices, if you don't remember the name, is the name of a book that we're using for this summer series. So you may be more familiar with the term the 7 deadly sins, but they were originally called the 7 capital vices. And so this book goes through the idea of vices and virtues. When I was in high school, there was a kind of a young family that volunteered with the youth group a lot, helped teach some of our classes. They told me once, or told us once, that they were trying for a period of time to say yes to any opportunity to serve at church. No matter how far outside of their comfort zone something seemed, they were committed to not saying no if they could possibly do it. I don't necessarily recommend that approach. Case in point, back in May, David texted me. David said, "Hey man, I'm looking for the summer teaching calendar. I'm planning a series on the 7 deadly sins for June and July. Would you be interested in taking a week or two?" He went on to ask whether there were any of the 7 that I was particularly interested in taking a crack at. I texted back, "I don't think I particularly have a favorite sin that I want to volunteer for, so I guess just give me whatever you can't give anybody else." He said, "Okay, I can do that. I'll let you know." So here we are. I'm super excited that there's no youth group class this morning, so we have a lot of the youth group with us in the room today too. Hope you're ready for this. I wanted to start out a little bit lighthearted, but the truth is I know this can be a heavy topic as well. I know there are probably some of us in the room that have been hurt by the church's teachings on sex or sexuality or lust, or possibly hurt by what a church failed to teach. There may be some of us that have been hurt by others, or some of us who feel shame about something or feel that we have things that we're unsafe to share. So you may have been hurt by things that you've done or things done to you. And one thing that I want to start out with that I think is sort of the foundation for the conversation that I want to have this morning is that you are the image of God. So I just want to start there to kind of ground us for the rest of the conversation. Because even after the fall, after sin has entered the world, God tells Noah in Genesis 9:6 that humans are the image of God and should be treated as such. I didn't realize I was going to get choked up so early in this conversation. But I just think we need to start there, that this is, after the fall, that God tells Noah this. And we need to remember that nothing that you've done, nothing that's been done to you, can change that reality, can make you any less the image of God, any less a child of God, or any less the beloved of God. So we're going to start there, and the topic of the day is lust, but I want to start first with just talking about kind of a healthy view of sexuality, because we're going to have to talk about the vice, but the vice is always a corruption of something good. And the truth is that sex is a wonderful, beautiful gift from God, and we need to start there. And so the book that we're using primarily for this summer series is called Glittering Vices, but I'm going to quote a couple of times from another book that also on the 7 deadly sins, called Fully Alive by a British author, Elizabeth Oldfield. So I wanted to start with this quote. She says, "Sex is an amazing, powerful gift for connection. Take it seriously. Because sex is something that God designed and that He blessed. And it's one of the most powerful methods of connection and bonding between people, but as people that are made for connection, that are so deeply impacted by relationships. It is that very power that can also lead to so much harm if it's misused or used carelessly. And that's why I think we need wisdom and discernment. And so we're going to be looking, like I said, at the ideas of virtue and vice, which are like practices and habits that form our character and that lead to well-formed loves instead of malformed loves. So I've talked enough. Let's go and get you guys talking. We're going to jump right into a table discussion. So the question is, what have you heard from the church about sex or lust? Was it talked about when you were growing up? What messages do you feel like you've heard? So I'll mute my mic for a few minutes and talk amongst yourselves. All right. I thought I might wait for a lull in the conversation, but I think it's getting louder and louder in the room. Jaren, do you want to go and grab the mic? All right, if there's anybody brave enough to share something about what y'all talked about at your table, my nearly perfect wife, Jaren, is going to be walking around with a microphone. So who wants to go first? I heard lots of chatter. I know y'all are talking about something. All right. You have to hold the mic relatively close to your mouth for it to work.
Well, one of the things is that sex is not always, lust is not always sex. It's a strong desire of any kind. We can lust after God. So that was the big thing that changed the view of that word and made it more about the reality of the word than just how we always viewed it and always taught it.
Okay, interesting. So the word lust doesn't have to be used about sex. It can be potentially any strong desire. I think when we talk about these 7 vices, Leanne talked about gluttony last week, there are a lot of similarities in terms of kind of how these strong desires can be malformed or go in the wrong direction as opposed to, the good virtues that we're supposed to pursue. Other thoughts? What did y'all share?
So we talked about a few things, and one of the things that I've learned coming up in the church is that's a topic that most people don't like to talk about. And so instead of being direct with a person, they would usually say to teens or young adults, sex is strictly for adults and married folks. It's safer with married folks because outside of marriage, anything can happen. Then we talked about lust, how we carry ourselves, how we dress, to make sure that the opposite sex does not lust after another person. And there was another topic, but I don't remember. But it's better to marry than to burn. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right.
On the topic of lust being for something else, as he mentioned a while ago, some people lust for gold. Some people lust for power. When the Red Army came into Germany at the end of World War II, they raped over 2 million women. Many people, probably in this room, do not know that, but that happened. And that was strictly a revenge power.
Yeah, when other dynamics like power dynamics mix in, it can make for a dangerous combination. Other thoughts? Anybody wants to share?
I forgot about the sex part, because I was on the other part. But the sex is taught that it's for 2 people to become one. That's the purpose of it. And to reproduce.
Okay.
So the only aspects that the church taught about sex.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate the conversation. I might keep us moving, I guess. But, all right. I think we're good on the mic. Thank you, Jaren. So a couple more slides on sex before we turn to lust, so to speak. These were the verses that I felt comfortable putting on the screen. There are a couple from the Song of Songs that I was not brave enough to put up here. We'll talk a little bit more about the Song of Songs later. But again, I wanted to ground us in the idea that this is something that God is not embarrassed to talk about. So one of the things that I heard was that we're not always good at talking about it. People don't like to talk about it. Sometimes what we say in the church is very limited or narrow, but we should ground ourselves in the fact that, this is something created by God, that God talks about, that we even have scriptures about. And then finally, I wanted to look at one more framework. This is something that I adapted from an author, Sheila Ray Gregoire. So when she talks about kind of the positive view of healthy sexuality within marriage, she says it should be mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. The mutual, one of the passages we can go to is 1 Corinthians 7, 4 through 5, which we're probably, if you've been in the church, somewhat familiar at least with this idea of don't deny one another. But I think what was especially radical for the time was that Paul says the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. The verse is completely symmetrical, completely mutual in that way. And when he said the first part, his audience would have been like, oh yeah, the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, it belongs to her husband. That's par for the course with the culture. But when he said the next part, that was radical for first century. There is a true mutuality in this. It goes both ways. Intimate, Genesis 4:1, now Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived. I guess the question is that more than just a euphemism? Is it just that God is embarrassed to not say Adam had sex with Eve? Is there deeper meaning to the use of the word know there? This is the same Hebrew word that in the Psalms says, God, know me, search my heart. And I do think there's more to it. I think it is a true intimacy and not just a euphemism there. And then for pleasurable for both, I just give you the whole book of Song of Songs. If you count up verses, she actually speaks more than he does. So both the man and the woman in Song of Songs speak about their desire. And it really is intended, for both. Okay, so let's talk about lust. And I want to ground us in a pretty well-known passage when Jesus addresses it in Matthew 5. But before we get to the actual lust part, I wanted to look at what he says immediately before it about anger, just because I think there's some hermeneutical similarities. So hermeneutics, if you've heard that word, is how we interpret the Bible, right? What are our principles for reading to know what the passage means? How do we really know what the author's point is? And when we look at what Jesus says about anger, I think we can kind of learn how to read this part of the Sermon on the Mount. So he says, you've heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So one of the things I want to think about is a casual reading of this passage could imply to us that just the emotion of anger is sin. Some of us may have even heard things like that in the church explicitly. But I think we know, I hope we know, that God created our emotions. I know Brandon has done a lot with the youth group over the last year or so on emotions. My wife Jaren taught a class on emotional well-being for the adults as well. I hope we're coming to realize that just feeling an emotion is not sin. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. Now, I don't want to in any way soften or downplay what he's talking about. I want to take him fully seriously, but I want to figure out what does he really mean by that word? And I think in this verse about anyone who's angry with his brother or sister, what the word means is probably something closer to rage. And what a lot of scholars point to is they think, Jesus is constantly pulling on the Old Testament. They memorized the Old Testament so well that you could just say a little thing and people's minds would go to the right passage. That there's probably an intentional hyperlink here to the very first murder in the Bible. So Genesis tells us, which verse? 4:5. In Genesis 4:5 says that Cain was very angry with his brother, and then he murdered him. So that's the order in Genesis 4. Cain is angry with his brother, and then he kills him. And so what we see here, Jesus almost seems to be presenting us with a series of things that in our mind, from a normal human perspective, they're becoming less severe. So you've got murder itself, that's the worst, right? Then you've got rage. then you've got a really bad insult, because raka is an Aramaic word that means empty. It means worthless. So you are declaring that your brother is just an empty vessel, no value inside, completely worthless. And then finally, just a lesser insult. You just say, you fool. But the consequences are sort of escalating. So first, judgment, then judgment by the Sanhedrin, which is like the Supreme Court, then the fires of hell. And what I think he's saying is maybe that essentially it's sort of the same sin underlying all of these. What you're doing is you're treating your brother as if he has no value at all. Right? If you say raka to your brother, you're saying you're just an empty, worthless person of no value. And if you murder someone, ultimately you're saying their life is of such little value that you can make the decision to just cast it aside. And then we find in James 3:9 that James says the reason we should not curse people is because they are the likeness of God. You may remember that verse. With the same tongue you praise God and you curse your brother, who is the likeness of God. So why should we not murder? God tells Noah in Genesis 9:6, the reason you should not murder is people are the likeness of God. Why should we not curse them? James tells us you should not curse your brother because people are the likeness of God. People are the imago Dei. We are the image of God. And if we treat people as worthless, if we treat them as empty, whether that's as extreme as murder or just saying raka, we're sinning against them because we're sinning against the image of God. We're not treating them with the value, the dignity, the respect that they deserve. But what do we do about it? It's really hard to just empty ourselves of rage, to just, I'm going to try really hard not to feel contempt and insults today. I'll just be empty of that. Well, Jesus says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. So what I think Jesus gives us is not just empty yourself of contempt and rage and insult, but proactively pursue reconciliation. Because we know that God gets angry. God is described as angry. We see Jesus get angry. I think anger was one of the dominant emotions of some of the prophets. But when we think about God getting angry, he's not defined as an angry God. He's defined as a God slow to anger but full of mercy. Right? He's full of mercy. He pursues reconciliation. And what we're supposed to do is not just empty ourselves of anger, but fill ourselves with mercy and reconciliation. Pursue the good. Okay, so let's keep that in mind and go to the next passage that Jesus talks about. I've got two translations here. The first one, Tim Mackey is the scholar that leads the Bible Project. So if you've ever watched the Bible Project videos or listened to their podcast, that's Tim Mackey. He translates it as, you have heard that it was said, you will not commit adultery. And I say to you that everyone who goes on looking at a woman in order to cultivate lust for her, he has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So I'm not a grammar geek. My kids at school have to learn Latin, so they learn a lot more about conjugating and things than I do. But what Tim Mackey says is that the verb there is a present active participle. So if you speak anything other than English, you might be better equipped to know what a present active participle is. English grammar is a little bit wonky. But apparently it means just an ongoing thing. It is a present but ongoing. Not something that's finished, not something that's completed, but a present ongoing verb. And so that's why he translates it as goes on looking at a woman. He says that he thinks what Jesus intends there is something akin to staring. Right? This is not someone who has looked at a woman, right? Or someone who has noticed a woman, but someone who goes on looking at a woman lustfully. Or he translates it in order to cultivate lust for her. The ESV is a really common, mainstream translation, so I also thought I'd look at that. And it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so I thought that was interesting because it adds the word intent in there. And so if we go back to this idea of like anger is not a sin as an emotion, I think that whenever we sin, we're making some choice. We have a say in the matter, right? There is an intent there when we choose to do wrong. And so what we're talking about here is something that we choose. If we also think about the idea of murder and anger, the deep sin there is treating people not as the image of God, but as something worthless. I think we can think the same with lust. If people are the image of God, if people are worthy of inherent dignity and respect, then when we lust after someone, we're not treating them the way that they deserve. I like this quote from Randy Harris. He has a book called Living Jesus, and he says, the deep sin attached to lust and pornography is that you use another person simply as an object of your desires. It's the ultimate selfish act. The other person doesn't matter at all, except as a means to fulfill your own desires. And that objectification of another person is a violation of their fundamental dignity. We have to look at people in a different way, as fellow human beings created in the image of God, as people worthy of our respect. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what lust is and what lust isn't. Do you recognize who this is? I heard a mumble, I didn't hear it. Anybody know? It's a young picture. Johnny Cash, that's right. All right, Johnny Cash. I don't actually want to talk about Johnny Cash, really. I just wanted to steal I Walk the Line. So I want to talk about walking the line. Although if you know Johnny Cash's story, he did not always do a great job of walking the line. So the phrase I walk the line is actually not too much of a stretch for me to steal it and use it to talk about lust, because he was talking about faithfulness. Ultimately did not remain faithful to his wife, but that was his promise in the song I Walk the Line. And so what does it mean to walk the line? I think that's often how we think about lust. I'm not sure it's necessarily the most helpful way to think about it. So here's one model, and I adapted this from Sheila Ray Gregoire as well. So if you're familiar with the DEFCON warning levels, it's sort of like escalating risk. So DEFCON 5, 1 is the worst, right? So it goes down in the DEFCONs. There's someone that you could be attracted to. You notice their body. You find them attractive. You feel tempted to lust. And then finally, lust. And this is, I think, a common model of how we think about it. So what could possibly be wrong with this? I think one thing is, when we think of this just sort of like smooth spectrum, continuous spectrum, it could be really easy to think of each step along the way as sin. But I want to propose to you today that not each step along the way is actually sin, and we need to be a little bit more careful about what we call sin and what we don't call sin. But if we recognize even that not every step along the way is sin, we can just really obsess about where to draw the line. Where exactly do I draw the line? Right? How do I move down the spectrum? Where do I cut it off? Where do I draw the line? This can make us really fearful of every step. I mean, you can be afraid of seeing people because it feels inevitable. You're just going to keep moving up the spectrum, and it can be terrifying if you think that, it's an almost inevitable end. So let's think about one other spectrum. Again, this is how Sheila Ray Gregoire talks about it. Exact same steps down the left, really. It's just an acknowledgement that at any point along this, we can just think nothing more of it and go along with the rest of our day. It is actually possible to recognize that someone is attractive and then do nothing more with that information and go on about the rest of your day. And that where it becomes sin is when we make the choice to lust, when we continue looking at someone in order to cultivate lust in our hearts, right? If we're ogling, if we're fantasizing, if we're intentionally choosing lust, that's a problem. We're not treating people with dignity. We're not treating people with respect. I also like this little phrase, not for me. You're going to notice that people are beautiful. We teach our children sometimes when they want that 8th cookie of the morning, it's not for you, right? We are designed to recognize beauty. That's innate. You can recognize beauty and say, but that beauty is not for me. I acknowledge there is beauty in the world. That's not for me. And that's okay. I can go on with the rest of my day. Leanne had a what gluttony is not slide last week, so I decided to steal the framework and talk about what lust is not. And some of these, I don't know, may even be controversial if you've always thought that these things were all lust. I just talked about how I think that noticing beauty is not lust. We will notice beauty. You cannot relate honestly to the world if you pretend that you do not notice beauty. I think God wants our honesty. I don't believe that attraction is lust. I don't believe that desire is lust. This may be the more controversial one, even arousal. But what I mean by arousal is sort of a physiological reaction. You cannot choose not to sweat when it's hot. People will be aroused by beauty. We can choose to say, that is not for me, and move on with the rest of our day, and not cultivate lust intentionally. And then this last one, there's actually a book by this name, and I'll admit I've not read the book, so I can't tell you everything about the book itself, but I think the framework is really common. This idea that lust is every man's battle. Lust is a big deal, but I think there can be some pitfalls to just saying that it's every man's battle. I actually heard somebody talking on a podcast once, and they said they were so obsessed with the idea of avoiding lust at all costs until they got married, that once they got married, they actually had a moment where they thought, do I even have to worry about sin anymore? They had sort of forgotten about all the other sins. Yes, you may struggle with lust, you may also struggle with gluttony or sloth or wrath. If lust is every man's battle, it sort of implies we don't have to worry about the other stuff as much. You may lust, your battle may be with wrath. You may have another battle that you need to focus on even more. It also can be really defeatist. If we just say, well, lust is always every man's battle, then that means you can never not lust. Sanctification is possible with the Spirit, right? We believe in a Lord that gives us freedom in Christ, right? This is something that people can overcome. We can be sanctified. We can be holy people. Yes, you will sin at times, but we should not just accept that all men are going to lust all the time. We don't do that with any other sin. We don't think, I'm just always going to be a glutton. Never get over that one. It also implies, maybe implicitly, I guess it doesn't say it exactly, but that lust is no woman's battle. We shouldn't say that. Both genders can struggle with lust. If you're a woman that has struggled with lust, you are not a weird unicorn. This is not abnormal, right? This is a normal thing. Not, again, to downplay the importance of sin. We shouldn't treat sin as normal. The fact that we are all susceptible potentially to any sin is normal. This is not a purely gendered thing. Okay, where am I going next? All right, I wanted to review the idea of these vices. We don't really talk about the 7 deadly sins in our tradition a lot. I'll admit I had no idea what it was at first. Is that some Catholic thing about what sins can be forgiven and what's not? And I don't mean that derogatorily. My dad's Catholic. I just didn't understand it. I'm or what level of hell you go to, or I don't know. Well, what it actually was it was very early sort of Christian spiritual directors. A lot of them were called the Desert Fathers because sometimes they'd go out into the desert to seek spirituality. When they would advise people would come to them with their spiritual problems. Their advice often boiled down to 7 things. If you're struggling with sin, if you're feeling detached from God, if you're not making progress spiritually, usually there are 7 things at the root of it. And they end up calling those 7 things envy, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust, vanity, and wrath. It does not mean they are the worst things, right? You don't see murder on here. You don't see adultery on here. It means these are the most common roots, so to speak. Or if I can mix my metaphors, these are like the headwaters the streams flow out of. So wrath could lead to murder, lust could lead to adultery, but the underlying struggles are most commonly these things. And they weren't called sins originally, they were called vices because of that idea of the virtue and vice ethics. The way to do good is to cultivate the character that does good. That's a virtue. The habit of doing bad is a vice. And so people also sometimes ask, well, why isn't pride one of them? Pride's kind of a big deal. Well, you can argue that pride is actually sort of the root of it all, and so I put pride on the trunk of the tree. It really does, potentially in some sense, all go back to pride. But these are, the vices against which we should develop spiritually by embracing the virtues that form our character in better ways. David just finished a sermon series called Unseen. And I think one of the points I want to make sure I make here is when we talk about lust and the virtues that we can pursue instead, the goal should not be to not see people. I think sometimes that can be how we think about lust, is I just need to not see people. That's not our goal. Our goal is to see people rightly, right? To see people truly as the image of God, not to just not see them. I mentioned Elizabeth Oldfield, who wrote Fully Alive, which is also about the 7 capital vices. I like this quote from her. People get hurt. And she's talking about the consequences of lust and how we treat our sexuality. People get hurt, and people are sacred. So I kind of grounded us in that idea of the Imago Dei, this idea of the sacredness of, she actually has a podcast called The Sacred. The sacredness of people is foundational to her, and so we need to be careful about things that can lead to people getting hurt. We need to ask maybe, how does lust deform my character, my perception, and my capacity to love? If I'm cultivating lust, is it changing how I relate to people? Is it impacting my friendships? Is it making me less capable of actually loving people well? And then finally, sorry, I guess our screen is not exactly centered. Leanne talked last week about with gluttony, are you consistently trying to meet other needs with food? I think there's kind of a similar idea here, right? A lot of times sex isn't just about sex. It's about depression. It's about loneliness. It's about shame. Are you trying to meet spiritual and or emotional needs through some form of sexuality on a consistent basis? Is this vice actually covering up a deeper spiritual need that we need to work on? And then here's a quote from the book that we're using for the summer series, Glittering Vices. Fulfilling pleasure without commitment and full human intimacy is lust's perennially empty promise. When we misuse something habitually, we find that we lose our ability to appreciate its true goodness. As with gluttony, the less likely we are to find our desire for pleasure satisfied. All right, let me see where I am in my notes. Do I have, okay, yeah. So I want to turn us back to the idea of virtue. I don't have great words here. A lot of these are kind of old words. The old term for the virtue is chastity. But I think to a lot of us, chastity just means abstinence. And what I'm looking for here is something broader than that. How do we form our heart to love in a virtuous way? How do we love people well? With anger, we talked about God being a God of mercy and reconciliation. You can see that here a little bit in Exodus 34:6, where he defines himself, the Lord, that's Yahweh, his name, he's defining his personal name, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow in anger. But then how does he continue to define himself, his nature? Abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That word there, steadfast love, is my favorite Hebrew word. It's hesed. Sometimes you see it written with a CH, which you don't say the cha. It's a way to indicate the Hebrew letter that's guttural, so I'm not very good at that, but it's like hesed is maybe the way they would say it. But hesed, the reason I love the word so much is it's usually translated something about love, but it's like equal parts love and loyalty. Love and loyalty. And so when God is a God of hesed, you see it translated steadfast love, faithful love, covenant love. And this is the God of Israel's covenant, who will not abandon them, because he has hesed. He has steadfast love. And I think that's what God is calling us to. How do all of our relationships reflect faithful love that is appropriate to the nature of that relationship, right? We have different spheres of loves. And I don't just mean like the 4 Greek words for love or whatever, although those can be helpful, but Jaren and I were talking about this the other night, and like the way that I love my biological brother is different than the way I love one of my best friends. The way that I love my BAML community may be different than the way that I love my colleagues at work. The way that I love my children is different than the way that I love my parents. And lust can be a malformed love that is not recognizing the right relationship and treating people appropriately. So how do we learn to love well and have God's hesed in all of our relationships? So if I go back to something about the Sermon on the Mount with both anger and lust, I don't want us to walk away today thinking that Jesus' primary emphasis is just what we should not do. That his main point is that we should just be empty of lust. Because I don't think that his main point is what we should not do. I think his main point is what we should do. It's not just being empty of anger or empty of lust. It is pursuing mercy and reconciliation and hesed, faithful love, appropriate loves, that we can pursue loyalty and covenant and steadfastness. I remember the story of an ex-con that converted to Christianity, and he befriended this little old lady in church that was sort of a spiritual mentor to him and a sort of an adopted grandmother. And he was reading through the Bible, and he came to her one day, and he said, "Have you read the Song of Songs? It's hot." And she said, "I don't think so. That's about Christ and the church." And he looked at her incredulously. He said, "No, have you read it? It's hot." Well, I have read the